Every morning felt like an uphill battle. The bus ride to school had become a routine that mirrored her life, predictable yet filled with the weight of unspoken burdens. The air in the bus was thick with the hum of conversations and the sound of tires against the pavement. She stood there, clutching the rail with one hand, the other tucked into her worn-out jacket pocket, eyes fixed on the road ahead. The day stretched before her, endless and uncertain, like the many mornings that had come before it. The young student had always been a dreamer, but these days her dreams felt distant, clouded by the harsh realities of her life. Financial stress weighed her down, and the uncertainty of her future often kept her up at night. There were no silver spoons in her family. In fact, sometimes it felt like there wasn't even a spoon to begin with. Her parents worked tirelessly, but the bills never seemed to stop coming. She had always been taught to be grateful for what she had, but it was hard to find that gratitude when the world felt so heavy. Her gaze often wandered outside the bus window, watching the city pass by in a blur of gray buildings and fading autumn leaves. Today was no different. The chill in the air reminded her that winter was just around the corner, and she had no idea how her family would manage. School was just another responsibility, a means to an end. But with each passing day, it felt more and more like a place where she was drifting, struggling to stay afloat. The bus jolted to a stop and the doors creaked open. Passengers piled on, some talking, others staring blankly ahead, but she barely noticed. It had become part of the routine, the chaotic shuffle, the silent weight of the ride. She had gotten used to it, like she had gotten used to everything else in her life. There was a sense of resignation, an understanding that things wouldn't change anytime soon. But then, the doors opened again and an elderly woman stepped aboard. The woman was frail, her back bent with age, her steps slow and deliberate. Her clothes were simple, yet there was something about her that caught the young student's attention. Maybe it was the way she moved so carefully, with a grace that seemed to defy her years. Or perhaps it was the kindness in her eyes, the quiet dignity she carried despite her apparent struggles. She seemed out of place standing there in the sea of young faces, her presence somehow different from the others. The bus was nearly full, and the student's heart sank a little. She knew it would be hard for the elderly woman to find a seat. Most people were too wrapped up in their own world to notice. The thought of standing for the entire ride was enough to make her feel uncomfortable, and she didn't even know the woman. But as the elderly lady made her way down the aisle, the student could see that she was having trouble. Her hands gripped the rail tightly as the bus moved along, her body swaying with the motion, struggling to keep balance. Without thinking, the young student stood up. It wasn't a grand gesture. In fact, it was probably the simplest thing she could have done. She hadn't even realized she had made the decision until she was already moving toward the vacant seat. As she glanced at the elderly woman, their eyes met for just a moment. There was a brief shared understanding. The woman's face lit up with a soft smile, one that spoke of gratitude and surprise. She nodded in thanks, and the student, though she felt a pang of awkwardness, smiled back and gestured to the seat. The elderly woman took her place, and the student stood by the window, her hand still gripping the rail, trying to steady herself in the jostling bus. She didn't think much of it. It wasn't as though she expected anything in return. She was just doing what felt right, and besides, she could stand for a few stops. It wasn't a big deal, but as the bus continued its journey, the atmosphere seemed to shift. For some reason, that small act, offering a seat to someone in need, felt like a quiet rebellion against the world's indifference. It was a reminder that, despite everything, there was still kindness to be found. The bus ride was uneventful after that. People got on and off, the city passed by in its usual hurry, and the elderly woman sat quietly, staring out the window. Occasionally, she would look around, but mostly she seemed lost in her own thoughts. The young student didn't mind the silence. It was peaceful in a way. Sometimes it was easier to just focus on the road ahead, to block out the noise of everything else. But as the bus neared her stop, the student noticed something that caught her eye. The elderly woman had pulled out a small worn notebook from her bag, and she was writing something in it, her hand steady despite the bus's movements. She had a calm demeanor about her, as if the world could be chaotic around her, but she would remain unmoved. The student couldn't help but wonder about the woman's life. What had she seen? What stories did she carry with her? There was something about her presence, something that made her feel like there was more to her than met the eye. The student's mind began to wander, but she quickly shook the thought away. She didn't have time for distractions. There were bills to pay, classes to attend, and a future to worry about. She had enough on her plate without imagining the lives of strangers. The bus slowed to a stop, and the young student stepped off, her bag slung over one shoulder, her thoughts still lingering on the old woman. She didn't know why, but there was something about her that felt significant. Something about that small act of kindness, giving up her seat, made the world feel a little less cold. It was as if, for a brief moment, the bus wasn't just a vehicle carrying people from one place to another, but a small space where the weight of the world could be momentarily lifted. As she walked down the street toward school, she pushed those thoughts aside. Life wasn't about grand gestures. It was about getting through the day, about surviving, about making it to the next one. The reality of her situation was all too clear. She wasn't about to get lost in fantasies about how small acts of kindness could change the world. That was a luxury she didn't have. But still, she couldn't shake the memory of the elderly woman's smile, the way it had lit up her face, so full of warmth and appreciation. It was a reminder that sometimes, even in a world that felt so overwhelming, small moments of kindness could still make a difference. And maybe, just maybe, that's what she needed to hold on to. Days passed, and the student's life continued its relentless rhythm. Morning started early with the same bus ride to school, filled with the usual crowd of tired commuters. The bus had become familiar, almost comforting in its routine. The faces of strangers had blurred together in the sea of commuters. Most people were absorbed in their own worlds, heads down, eyes focused on their phones or lost in thought. For the student, it felt like she was part of that same blur, a small piece in a larger machine that just kept moving forward no matter what. School was a struggle, not because she wasn't capable. She had always been a diligent student, pushing herself to do well. But the weight of financial pressures and the constant worry about her family's future made it hard to focus. The textbooks seemed to grow heavier with every page she turned. Her part-time job after school didn't make things easier either. It was exhausting, and sometimes it felt like she was running on empty, just trying to keep up. There was no time to think about anything else, no time for hobbies or dreams, just the constant need to survive. The student's family was doing their best, but it never seemed to be enough. Her parents worked long hours, and though they loved each other deeply, there was always tension at home. The bills piled up faster than they could pay them, and the stress hung in the air like a constant shadow. Every conversation was about money, how to stretch it a little further, how to get by. Her younger siblings, unaware of the full extent of their struggles, still held on to their innocence, laughing and playing without worry. But the student couldn't share that same sense of carefree joy. She was the eldest, the one who had to carry the weight of responsibility. Her grades were decent, but she had always been a perfectionist, and the thought that they weren't perfect ate at her. Every test result, every paper, every assignment felt like a reflection of her worth, and she couldn't help but feel like she was falling short. It wasn't that she didn't care about her education, she did. She knew that if she could just finish her studies, maybe things would get better. But there were days when it felt like an impossible task, as though the finish line was always just out of reach. And then there were those small moments of doubt. She had friends, but they were too caught up in their own lives to understand what she was going through. They didn't know about the late-night shifts at the diner, the hours spent studying while her family struggled to make ends meet. They didn't know that she often went to bed hungry because there was simply not enough food to go around. They didn't know the fear she felt every time the bills came in, or the anxiety that gripped her whenever she thought about the future. Despite all of this, she had a quiet resilience about her. She knew there was no way to change things overnight. It would take time, but she wasn't going to give up. She had seen her parents struggle, and if they could do it, so could she. The student pushed through the exhaustion, the worry, the uncertainty. She held on to the belief that if she kept moving forward, things would eventually get better. That morning, as she boarded the bus once again, the routine felt familiar, almost comforting. She stood by the door, her hand gripping the rail as the bus moved through the city streets. She glanced around, half absorbed in her thoughts, when she noticed something familiar. The elderly woman was there again. She was sitting in the same seat, looking out the window, her face serene despite the bus's jarring movements. The student hadn't seen her for a few days, But there was something about this moment that made her feel a strange sense of peace. There was something about the woman's quiet presence that felt grounding, like an anchor in the midst of her chaotic world. She didn't know why, but it felt like a small shared connection, something that brought a little warmth to her otherwise cold mornings. The old woman didn't seem to notice the student as she got on. She was lost in her own world, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes distant but calm. It was as if time moved differently for her. The student wondered what it was like to have that kind of peace, to be so content with the world around you. Her own mind was always racing, always thinking of the next thing, the next problem, the next worry. But the old woman, she seemed different. She had a kind of wisdom that only came from living through things, from experiencing the highs and lows of life. The student could see it in the way she moved, slow, deliberate, yet graceful. She had lived a full life, and somehow, that made her seem timeless. The student couldn't help but wonder what kind of stories the woman carried within her. She had a feeling that there was more to this woman than she would ever know, more than met the eye. The bus rumbled on and the student tried to focus on the day ahead. The sounds of the city faded into the background as her mind drifted. She couldn't help but think about her own situation, about the endless cycle of work and study, the constant pressure to succeed, to do well, to make something of herself. She was always thinking about the future, about how she could escape her current reality, but it was hard to see the way forward. Sometimes it felt like she was just spinning her wheels, moving but not getting anywhere. And yet there was a small part of her that held on to hope. Maybe, just maybe, if she kept working hard, if she kept pushing through, things would change. But it was a fragile hope, one that she didn't allow herself to think about too much. Hope, she had learned, could be dangerous. It made you believe in things that might never happen. It set you up for disappointment. But she couldn't shake it. There was a part of her that still believed things could get better, even if she didn't know how. The bus ride was mostly silent after that. The old woman sat peacefully, staring out the window, and the student stood lost in thought. A few stops later, the elderly woman rang the bell to signal her stop. She stood slowly, moving with the same careful grace she always had. As she walked toward the door, she glanced at the student and smiled, a small knowing smile, one that seemed to say that she understood. For a moment, their eyes met again, and the student felt a sense of recognition, as though they shared some unspoken bond. But the woman was gone before she could think any more about it, stepping off the bus into the crowd, disappearing into the busy city streets. As the student took her seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The moment had been brief, but there was something significant about it. Maybe it was the old woman's quiet presence or the way she seemed to move through life with such grace and calm. The student found herself thinking about the woman more than she had before, wondering about her life, about the stories she must have. There was a wisdom there, something that seemed to resonate with her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Classes were long and tiring, and the weight of her responsibilities followed her every step. But the memory of that brief encounter lingered in her mind like a soft echo. There was something about that woman, something that made her feel like she wasn't entirely alone in the world, even though it often felt that way. It was a strange comfort, one that she couldn't quite explain. She returned home that evening, tired but restless. The day's worries settled into the back of her mind as she prepared for another shift at the diner. Her family was busy with their own tasks, but she noticed her parents exchanging glances, the silent understanding between them. The student knew they were talking about money again, about how to make ends meet, but they didn't say anything out loud. It was the unspoken language of struggle, of doing whatever it took to survive. As she finished her shift, the thought of the old woman lingered. She wondered, not for the first time, what it would be like to have a life with a little more peace, a little more stability. She didn't need to be rich. She just needed a break, a chance to breathe. Maybe, just maybe, that quiet, simple woman on the bus had something to teach her, something she hadn't even realized she needed to learn yet. The days blurred together as the student continued her routine. School was just another task to get through. The bus rides felt like fleeting moments of quiet, and work kept her going late into the night. The exhaustion was a constant presence, but so was the resolve to keep going. She didn't have time to think about dreams or the things she wanted out of life. The focus was simple: survive, get through the day, and hopefully things would get better someday. But the old woman had begun to occupy her thoughts in a way she hadn't expected. Every morning when she boarded the bus, The elderly lady's calm presence seemed to have a quiet effect on her. She wondered if she could ever reach that level of peace or if it was even possible to escape the constant pressure of life's burdens. It wasn't that the woman seemed to be living a perfect life. Rather, it was the way she carried herself. It was as though the struggles of the world hadn't hardened her, and despite everything she had likely endured, she still wore an aura of grace. The student began to look forward to these brief moments on the bus, as small as they were. It wasn't the comfort of her own seat or the chance to rest her tired legs, but something about the elderly woman's quiet demeanor had started to give her a sense of reassurance. In the midst of her daily grind, these moments felt like small islands of calm in a stormy sea. Some days the student would see the woman before she boarded the bus. She had a quiet, almost unremarkable routine, sitting down early, always picking the same spot by the window, and staring out at the world with an expression that seemed both distant and deeply thoughtful. The student didn't know what it was, but there was something about the old woman's calmness that made the student feel like she wasn't entirely alone in the world. There was some sort of understanding between them, though neither of them had spoken much. She never had the courage to say more than a brief hello. The elderly woman's gentle smile had become a daily comfort, but she kept her distance, unsure of how to approach the stranger who had begun to make such an impact on her life without even trying. The old woman's smile was often the only thing that made the morning feel less like a struggle. It wasn't until one afternoon, when the bus was particularly crowded, that the student found herself sitting next to the elderly woman for the first time. The bus had been packed to the brim, and with every stop, more people squeezed in. There were no vacant seats left, and it seemed like the entire bus was standing shoulder to shoulder. As luck would have it, the elderly woman, noticing that the student was standing uncomfortably, offered her seat. This time the student didn't hesitate. She gratefully accepted the offer, lowering herself onto the seat beside the woman. It was a small gesture, one that felt simple, but somehow significant. As the student sat down, she found herself feeling embarrassed. She had offered her seat before, but now she was the one taking it. She was suddenly acutely aware of how little she knew about this woman, even though she had seen her every day for weeks. It was a strange thought. She had been sharing these quiet moments with someone, and yet they had barely exchanged more than a few words. The world outside the bus seemed so distant, and for once she allowed herself to settle into the stillness that filled the space between them. The elderly woman broke the silence with a soft smile and a gentle comment. "It's crowded today, isn't it?" she said, her voice calm, yet with a warmth that reached the student's heart. The student nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude toward this woman who had been nothing but kind. "Yes, it is," she replied, her voice soft, almost shy. "I'm glad you offered your seat." The woman's smile deepened. "You've been kind to me before, so I thought it was only right to return the favor." The words caught the student off guard. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the offer, but it was the way the woman spoke that made her pause. There was something familiar about her tone, as if she had been around long enough to understand how life worked. The kind of understanding that could only come with time. "I remember," the student said, almost surprised by her own words. "I gave you my seat a while ago." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, kindness is never wasted. It might not always come back right away, but it always finds its way back eventually." She paused, her eyes drifting to the window. "It's the small things, you know. They make the world a little less heavy." The student hadn't expected the conversation to take such a turn. The woman's words were simple, but they seemed to resonate deeply with her. In all her days of struggling to balance school, work, and family, she had never stopped to think about life that way. She was always focused on the next task, the next hurdle to overcome. She was always pushing forward, never allowing herself to truly stop and think about how kindness, no matter how small, could have a lasting impact. As the bus made its way through the streets, the student found herself listening intently to the woman's soft, steady voice. There was a kind of quiet wisdom in the way she spoke, nothing rushed or frantic, just simple truths spoken with sincerity. "Life isn't about getting everything right," the woman continued, her eyes still fixed on the world outside. "It's about doing what you can with what you have. Sometimes that's all you can do, and that's enough." The student couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone was telling her it was okay not to have all the answers. Someone was giving her permission to stop, to breathe, to not be perfect. It It was as though the weight of her responsibilities, the pressure she felt to succeed, to fix everything, had momentarily lifted. The bus ride felt shorter that day. The conversations around her seemed quieter, the noise of the world outside less overwhelming. For a moment she allowed herself to sink into the peace that surrounded them. She didn't have to think about the bills at home or the long shifts at the diner. She didn't have to think about her grades or how exhausted she felt every single day. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was the quiet exchange between two strangers, and the comfort that kindness, however small, could bring. The bus arrived at her stop, and the student reluctantly stood up, feeling a pang of disappointment. She wasn't ready to leave the woman's quiet presence, but the reality of her day awaited her. As she stepped off the bus, she turned to give the elderly woman a small wave. "Thank you," she said softly, unsure of what else to say. The woman's smile was gentle, like a secret shared between them. "You're welcome, my dear," she replied. "And remember, kindness always finds a way back to you." The student didn't know what it was, but there was something deeply comforting in those words. They were a quiet promise, a reminder that even in the midst of her struggles there was goodness in the world. That maybe, just maybe, the weight of her responsibilities didn't have to define her. She didn't need to carry it all on her own. As she walked away, the words lingered in her mind. Kindness always finds a way back to you. It wasn't something she had ever really believed before, but now, it felt like a seed had been planted. Maybe there was something to the old woman's quiet wisdom. Maybe, if she could hold on to that, things would start to shift. Maybe the world wasn't as heavy as it seemed, and for the first time in a long while the student allowed herself to hope. Not for grand changes or quick fixes, but for small moments of peace, of kindness, of understanding. Because perhaps those were the things that made all the difference. The student didn't expect much from the routine she had built for herself. Life had a way of moving without giving her time to pause or even think about what she really wanted. It was all about the next task, the next responsibility. Every day the pattern repeated itself. Wake up early, go to school, work late, and then crash into bed only to do it all over again. Yet with every passing day, the small moments, the quiet exchanges, seemed to weigh more heavily on her mind. She found herself looking forward to the bus rides more than ever before, especially the moments when the elderly woman was there. It wasn't that the old lady did anything special. She never offered grand advice or life-changing secrets. But there was something about her presence that brought comfort. It was a constant in her chaotic world, a small anchor in the storm. The student started to realize that those brief moments of peace were the only times she truly felt still. Sitting in silence, watching the city pass by, she didn't have to think about the next assignment, the bills at home, or the late-night shifts at the diner. For a few minutes each day, she could just be, and there was something powerful in that. Yet despite the small comfort these moments gave her, there was still the weight of everything else. Her family's struggles never seemed to let up, and the pressure to do well in school felt like it would break her. The idea of failure hung over her like a dark cloud. She feared that if she didn't push through, if she didn't somehow make things work, everything would fall apart. She wanted so badly to make her parents proud, to ease their burdens, but the task felt overwhelming. It wasn't long before she started to notice the woman more, not just in the way she sat, the way she spoke softly, but in the small details. The old woman's hands were lined with age, her nails carefully manicured despite her simple clothing. She carried herself with quiet dignity, as though she knew the value of every step she took. The student began to wonder what kind of life the woman had lived. What experiences had shaped her into someone so calm, so sure of herself, even in the face of a world that often didn't seem to care. One morning, as the bus rattled along its usual route, the student found herself sitting next to the woman again. It wasn't the crowding that had forced her into the seat beside the elderly lady this time, but rather a sense of something drawing her closer. Maybe it was the strange connection she felt, something she couldn't explain but couldn't ignore either. She couldn't help but feel that there was more to this quiet woman than she had initially thought. The old woman glanced over at her, noticing that the student was lost in thought. There was a softness in her gaze, as though she could sense the weight the student carried, even though they had never spoken of it. "You're carrying a lot, aren't you?" the woman said, her voice low and gentle. "I can see it in your eyes." The student froze, startled by the observation. She hadn't expected the woman to speak so directly, and yet, There was something about the way she said it that made it feel like a truth, not a judgment. How did she know? The student wondered. She hadn't said a word about her struggles, yet this woman seemed to see right through her. I guess I am, the student replied quietly. It's hard to balance everything, school, work, family. It's like I'm always running and I never seem to get ahead. The elderly woman nodded slowly, her face thoughtful. I understand, she said, her voice warm. Life has a way of making us feel like we're always chasing something. But sometimes we need to stop and breathe. You can't keep running without pausing to catch your breath. Life doesn't move at your pace just because you want it to. The student let out a small sigh. She didn't know why, but the woman's words felt like a balm to her weary soul. There was truth in them, something she had known deep down but hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. Life wasn't something she could control by sheer willpower, and no matter how hard she tried, there would always be things outside her grasp. I don't know how to stop, the student admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. If I stop, everything might fall apart. I don't want to disappoint anyone. The woman turned toward her, a soft, knowing smile on her face. I think you're worried about the wrong thing. The question isn't whether you'll disappoint others. It's whether you're disappointing yourself by not giving yourself the space to breathe. We can't pour from an empty cup. You need to take care of yourself too. The student hadn't thought about it like that before. She had always focused on what others needed from her. Her family, her friends, her teachers. But what about her own needs? What about the things she needed to be happy, to feel whole? She realized, perhaps for the first time, that she had been so focused on surviving that she hadn't thought about living. I don't know if I'm strong enough to slow down, she said, her voice filled with doubt. There's so much I have to do. I can't afford to take a break. The old woman's smile never wavered. Strength isn't about never stopping. It's about knowing when to rest. When you allow yourself to pause, you'll find the strength you need to keep going. But that comes with time. You have to learn to trust yourself, to trust that everything will work out the way it's meant to. The student mulled over the woman's words as the bus continued on its journey. The noise of the city outside faded into the background, and for once she felt like she wasn't just going through the motions. The elderly woman's quiet wisdom had opened something inside her, a part of her that had been closed off for so long. She had always felt like she was carrying the weight of the world, like every decision she made mattered. Every step had to be perfect. But now the idea of letting go, of trusting that things would work out, didn't seem as impossible as it had before. The idea of slowing down, of pausing to breathe, felt like it was within reach, even if it scared her. I'll try, the student said finally, her voice steady. I'll try to trust more. I'll try to take things one step at a time. The elderly woman gave a soft nod, as though she had been waiting for the student to say those words. That's all anyone can do. Just take it one step at a time. As the bus neared the student's stop, she realized that this moment, this brief conversation, had changed something inside her. She wasn't sure how it would play out, but she knew that the old woman's words had given her a new perspective. Life wasn't something to be endured, a series of endless tasks to check off. It was something to be lived, something to be experienced. And maybe, just maybe, if she took it slow, if she allowed herself to rest, she could find her way through the struggle without losing herself in it. When the bus stopped and the student prepared to leave, she turned to the woman once more. Thank you, she said, her voice full of gratitude. You've given me something to think about. The elderly woman smiled again, the same soft, knowing smile. It's all within you, she said simply. You just have to believe it. As the student stepped off the bus and walked into the crowd, she felt a quiet sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. There was still much to be done, much to face, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it, not by pushing herself harder, but by allowing herself the space to breathe, to trust, and to believe that everything would fall into place, just as it was meant to. The days that followed felt different somehow. Not because everything had magically changed overnight, but because the student had started to see things through a new lens. The elderly woman's words had lingered in her mind, and they started to shape her perspective in ways she hadn't anticipated. She wasn't sure how it would all unfold, but there was a quiet hope that had settled in her heart. Hope that things could get better, if only she allowed herself to trust in the process. The bus rides became less of a burden and more of a moment to pause. The student no longer felt the need to rush through them, her mind constantly ticking through the to-do list of the day. Instead, she found herself looking out the window more often, watching the city go by in its usual rhythm, but somehow feeling more connected to it. The world didn't seem as overwhelming as it had before, though the weight of her responsibilities was still there. But now she carried it with a little more grace, a little more patience. She also began to take the old woman's advice to heart. When things felt too heavy, when the pressure of school and work and life in general started to feel unbearable, she made a conscious effort to take a step back. It wasn't easy. Her mind often fought against the idea of slowing down, but she found small ways to practice it. She would take a few minutes in the morning to sit quietly, even before she got out of bed, just to breathe and center herself. She would pause during study sessions, giving herself short breaks, letting her mind rest before diving back in. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. But perhaps the most profound shift was in her mindset. Instead of seeing each day as a series of tasks to get through, she started to see them as opportunities. Opportunities to learn, to grow, to be present. She understood now that there was no point in racing toward the finish line if she wasn't truly living in the moments along the way. The fear of failure, the constant worry that she wasn't doing enough, slowly began to lose its grip on her. She realized that doing her best rather than being perfect was enough. And that was a powerful revelation. One morning as she boarded the bus again, she found herself looking for the elderly woman. It had become a small ritual, searching for the familiar face in the crowd. Today, though, the seat by the window was empty. For a moment, she felt a twinge of disappointment, but then she remembered what the woman had told her. Kindness would always find its way back, even if it took time. The student sat down, her mind wandering back to the conversation they had shared. She hadn't expected to feel so deeply affected by a simple exchange, but the old woman had opened a door in her heart. It was a door she had kept closed for so long, locked away behind the constant hustle of trying to survive, but now she could breathe a little easier. She could smile a little more genuinely. The next few weeks passed in much the same way, with the student continuing to focus on the things that mattered most: her studies, her family, and importantly, her own well-being. She no longer felt the need to prove herself to everyone around her. She was learning to give herself the grace she had so often extended to others. She was learning to trust that despite the uncertainties of life, she was exactly where she needed to be. Then, one afternoon, something happened that changed everything. The student had just finished a long shift at the diner and was on her way home. Her body exhausted, but her mind more at peace than it had been in a long time. She boarded the bus, her usual spot by the door waiting for her. She didn't immediately notice the elderly woman sitting in her usual spot by the window. It wasn't until the bus made its first stop that the student saw her. This time, she was accompanied by a man in a sharp suit, standing beside her with a respectful posture. As the student looked closer, she realized with surprise that the man was not just any businessman. He was someone she recognized from the news, a well-known entrepreneur, the grandson of the elderly woman she had been sitting next to for so long. She had heard stories about him, the self-made millionaire, the successful CEO who had built his fortune from the ground up. She had no idea, though, that this was the same person. The man looked at her, his eyes warm, and smiled as if he recognized her too. The student's heart skipped a beat, unsure of what was happening. The elderly woman turned to her and smiled, as if this encounter was nothing out of the ordinary. "Hello, my dear," the elderly woman said gently. "I hope you're doing well." The student, still a bit taken aback, smiled back, trying to mask her surprise. "Yes, I'm doing much better, thank you." The man spoke next, his voice kind but direct. "My grandmother has told me so much about you. How kind you've been to her, offering her your seat, and how thoughtful you've been whenever you've sat next to her. She admires you greatly." The student's face flushed. She hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected to be recognized by someone of his stature, let alone be praised for something so simple. She had never expected anything in return for her kindness. It was just something she did without thinking. But hearing this now from the millionaire himself left her speechless. "I'm truly grateful for what you've done for her," the man continued. "You've given my grandmother a lot of joy with your small acts of kindness. She's been telling me about you for weeks now, and I felt it was time I came to meet you myself." The student was stunned, trying to process what was happening. The elderly woman, who had been nothing but a quiet presence in her life, was the grandmother of a man who could have easily changed the course of her future, with just a single phone call. And yet he wasn't here to offer charity or to boast about his success. Instead, he was offering his genuine appreciation. I didn't do anything special, the student finally managed to say, her voice shaky. I just gave her my seat. The man smiled again, a knowing look in his eyes. Sometimes the smallest gestures make the biggest impact. My grandmother sees kindness in the simplest of things, and I think you've taught her something that I don't always see. How much power there is in just being present and showing up for someone. The elderly woman nodded, her eyes filled with emotion. It's not the big things that matter most, my dear. It's the quiet moments, the little acts of kindness. They're the things that stay with us. The student could hardly believe what she was hearing. In her mind, she had simply done what anyone should have done. She had never imagined that such a small act could make such an impact. But in this moment, surrounded by people who appreciated her, it felt like the world was opening up in a way she had never expected. I would like to help you, the man said, his voice earnest. My grandmother and I have been talking about the future, about what you're working toward. I want to offer you a scholarship, something to help you with your studies, with your dreams. You've shown my grandmother that there's still good in the world, and I want to give you the opportunity to pursue whatever it is you're passionate about. The student's mind reeled. A scholarship? From a millionaire? She could hardly believe it. But as she looked at the elderly woman who was smiling warmly at her, she realized that this wasn't just about money. It was about recognition. It was about the acknowledgement of the simple human acts that often went unnoticed. This scholarship wasn't just a financial gift. It was a symbol of how kindness had a way of coming full circle. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she struggled to find the right words. I don't know what to say. This is more than I ever imagined. The elderly woman reached over and took her hand, her touch gentle and reassuring. You don't need to say anything, dear. Just keep being who you are. That's more than enough. As the student stepped off the bus that day, her heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. She had never imagined that one small act of kindness, offering a seat to someone in need, could change the course of her life. But in that moment, she understood something profound. Kindness had a way of returning when least expected, and sometimes it led to doors opening that she hadn't even known existed. For the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful about the future. She wasn't sure where the road ahead would take her. But she knew one thing for certain. She would keep walking it with kindness, and with the belief that, no matter how small, every good deed had its own power to transform the world. The student couldn't remember the last time she had felt so many emotions at once. Shock, disbelief, gratitude. Each one hit her like waves crashing over her with no warning. When she left the bus that day, her mind kept replaying the conversation with the elderly woman and her grandson. The offer of the scholarship was something she had never imagined. Something that had seemed so far out of reach, and yet now it was real. That evening, she couldn't bring herself to share the news with her family immediately. She wanted to savor the feeling of it just being hers for a little while longer. For once, she didn't feel like the weight of the world was pressing down on her. The scholarship wasn't just a financial boost, it was a reminder that there were people who saw her, who recognized the quiet strength it took to keep going day after day, even when the world felt heavy. She sat in her room for hours that night, contemplating what this meant for her future. The thought of school no longer felt as overwhelming. Instead of seeing her studies as a series of hurdles to jump over, she began to see them as steps toward something bigger. The future wasn't a distant dream anymore. It was something she could now reach for with both hands. But the next morning, when she woke up and faced her family, it was different. There was still so much uncertainty. Her parents were thrilled for her, of course, but there was also that undercurrent of worry. They had always been supportive, but deep down, they knew how difficult things had been. There had always been that fear of what might happen if things didn't work out, if the student couldn't make it through. I still can't believe it, her mother said as they sat down for breakfast. A scholarship from someone like him? I mean, I'm so proud of you, but it's a lot to take in. The student smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. I never expected it either. It just feels so unreal, but I'm going to make the most of it. I promise. Her father gave her a reassuring pat on the back. You deserve it. We've always known you were capable of great things. Just don't forget where you came from. She nodded, feeling a mixture of emotions. Her parents had always worked hard to provide for their family. Their sacrifices were part of why she pushed herself so hard, why she kept going even when it felt like the road would never end. She didn't want to let them down, but now she also realized that this was her moment. The scholarship wasn't just a handout. It was a chance for her to change the direction of her life. And she wasn't going to waste it. The days that followed were filled with a whirlwind of preparations. The student met with the man who had offered her the scholarship several times. He wasn't like the people she had imagined him to be. Yes, he was wealthy, successful, and had every reason to be proud of his accomplishments. But he wasn't aloof or distant. Instead, he treated her like an equal, offering advice and wisdom without any hint of arrogance. He explained that success wasn't just about financial wealth, but about personal growth, about learning to adapt to the challenges life threw at you, and about giving back to others whenever you could. The student was surprised by how much she admired him, not just because of his wealth, but because of the way he viewed life. He spoke about his own struggles, about the failures that had shaped him, and about the importance of staying grounded no matter how far you went. It was a side of success she hadn't seen before, the kind that was rooted in humility, hard work, and integrity. She continued with her studies, but now there was a lightness in her heart. The pressure of keeping up with the bills and her job at the diner was still there, but it didn't consume her the way it once had. She was beginning to learn how to balance everything, how to be present in each moment, to show up for her family, her studies, and most importantly, herself. There were still hard days, of course. There were days when she felt exhausted, when the weight of expectations both from herself and others threatened to overwhelm her. But she had learned something important in the past few weeks. It was okay to feel tired, to need a break, to take a step back when things got too much. She didn't need to be perfect, and she didn't need to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. She was allowed to take care of herself. One afternoon, after finishing a particularly tough exam, she found herself sitting at the local cafe, sipping her coffee, trying to unwind. Her phone buzzed with a message from the elderly woman. It was a simple text, just a few words, but it made her smile. Just checking in. Hope you're doing well, my dear. The student felt a warm sense of gratitude flood her chest. She had come to think of the woman as more than just someone she shared a bus ride with. The elderly woman had become a source of quiet wisdom, someone who had unknowingly guided her toward a path of greater self-acceptance and peace. The simple, steady presence of someone who had lived through so much had given the student the strength to believe in herself, to believe that she was worthy of the opportunities that had come her way. The student quickly typed back, "Thank you for everything. I'm doing much better. I feel like I'm finally finding my way." She felt the weight of the past few years lift a little with each word she typed. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving. She was starting to live again. As the weeks passed, the student's life began to change in ways she couldn't have predicted. The scholarship opened doors to new opportunities, and she found herself surrounded by people who believed in her, who saw her potential, and who pushed her to reach even higher. She was no longer alone in her struggles. She had a support system, a family, friends, mentors, and the elderly woman, whose quiet wisdom continued to guide her from afar. One evening, as she walked home after a long day, she paused and looked up at the sky. The world felt different now. Not perfect, but full of possibilities. She was no longer afraid of the future or overwhelmed by the challenges that awaited her. She had learned to trust in herself, to believe that, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, she was capable of handling whatever came her way. As the city buzzed around her, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything she had, her family, her friends, and the unexpected connections that had helped her grow. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she was excited to see where it would take her. Whatever happened, she knew one thing for certain. Kindness had changed her life, and she would carry that lesson with her always. With each step, she moved forward, more confident, more at peace, and more sure than ever that she had the strength to create a future that was all her own.